In Westchester, the Whitmores were the kind of family people photographed at charity galas and whispered about with admiration. No one ever wondered what darkness it takes to keep a house that bright. The Whitmore house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Westchester, its white colonial exterior glowing under soft landscape lighting that automatically switched on at dusk. The neighbors often slowed their cars when passing by, not because the house was the largest, but because it was the most composed. It looked curated, balanced, untouched by chaos. Inside, Margaret Whitmore stood at the kitchen island slicing lemons into perfect halves. The granite countertop reflected her face faintly, 42 years old, composed, immaculate. Her dark hair fell in controlled waves over a silk blouse she had chosen carefully for tonight's dinner. A fundraiser, of course. There was always a fundraiser. "Mom, where's my black blazer?" Lily called from upstairs. "In your closet, second rack," Margaret replied automatically. She didn't look up. From the living room, Richard's voice carried through the house as he paced during a phone call. "No, that acquisition won't move forward without my signature," he said calmly. "And I don't sign anything I haven't reviewed personally." Margaret paused. That voice, firm, respected, controlled. She remembered when it used to soften for her. Richard entered the kitchen, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored, his tie a restrained navy. He looked like the kind of man people trusted with their money and their secrets. "You ready?" he asked. Margaret nodded. Almost. He leaned down to kiss her cheek. It landed near her skin, but not quite on it. A practice gesture. "Big night," he said. "The firm's expanding to Boston. This dinner matters." "Everything matters," she murmured. He didn't catch the tone, or maybe he did. Their son Caleb appeared at the doorway, earbuds in, hoodie half-zipped. 16. Watchful. "You guys leaving again?" he asked. "It's one dinner," Richard said lightly. "We'll be back by 11. Caleb gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure." Margaret noticed it. She always noticed. Later that evening, under crystal chandeliers at the country club, Margaret stood beside Richard as cameras flashed. Her hand rested at his elbow. His palm pressed against the small of her back. They looked intimate. They were not. "You two are marriage goals," one woman laughed, sipping champagne. Margaret smiled on cue. If marriage were a performance, she thought, they deserved an award. Across the room, Richard laughed with investors. His hand lingered on a colleague's shoulder, a tall brunette named Vanessa Cole. Margaret had met her twice. Smart, elegant, slightly too familiar. Margaret turned away before her thoughts could form something sharper. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. Unknown number. She hesitated before stepping toward the terrace doors and answering. "Hello? Mrs. Whitmore?" The voice was male, younger. "Yes?" "This is Julian Hayes, Lily's music teacher. I just wanted to confirm tomorrow's rehearsal time." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself against the cool glass of the door. "Yes, 4 o'clock, she said. "Thank you for calling." "Of course. And she's very talented. You should be proud." The warmth in his tone startled her. "I am," she replied softly. There was a pause, a small, suspended thing between strangers. "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore." "Margaret," she corrected before thinking. Another pause. "Good night, Margaret." She ended the call and stared at her reflection in the glass. For the first time that evening, her pulse had shifted. Not because of desire, because someone had looked at her as if she were more than a silhouette beside a powerful man. Inside, Richard's laughter rose above the crowd. Margaret watched him through the glass, confident, admired, untouched by doubt. And for reasons she couldn't yet name, she felt something inside her tilt. Not broken, not yet, just slightly off balance. When they drove home that night, silence filled the car. Streetlights streaked across the windshield in soft gold lines. "You were quiet," Richard said finally. "So were you." He glanced at her. "We're just tired." She looked out the window at the darkened houses they passed. Tired. Yes, that was one word for it. At home, Caleb's bedroom light was still on. Lily had left sheet music scattered across the piano bench. The house felt staged even in disarray. Margaret stood in the hallway after Richard disappeared into his office for one last email. She walked toward the piano and touched the edge of the sheet music. Her phone buzzed again. A text. "Julian Hayes. Looking forward to tomorrow. Lily really shines when you're in the room. Margaret read it twice. Her reflection in the dark piano lid looked unfamiliar. Younger, almost luminous. Upstairs, Richard's office door closed. Downstairs, Margaret typed back, "Thank you, I'll be there." She hesitated, then added, "Call me Margaret." She pressed send before she could reconsider. The house remained quiet. Perfect, intact. But somewhere, within its polished walls, a small door had just opened into the dark. And no one, not even Margaret, understood how much light it would eventually destroy. The next afternoon arrived with a thin veil of rain over Westchester, the kind that softened the edges of the world without fully washing anything clean. Margaret sat in her car outside the small brick studio where Lily's private lessons were held. The windshield wipers moved in a steady rhythm. Inside, warm lights peeled from tall windows, and faint piano notes floated into the grey air. She checked her reflection in the rear-view mirror. It wasn't vanity, it was awareness. When she stepped inside, the scent of polished wood and sheet music paper greeted her. The studio walls were lined with framed concert posters, Carnegie Hall recitals, regional competitions, a younger Julian Hayes standing beside the grand piano, smiling with shy pride. Julian looked up from the bench as Lily ran through a complicated Chopin passage. He wore a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms. No tie, no pretense. "Good afternoon, Margaret," he said, standing. There was something deliberate about the way he said her name. "Good afternoon," she replied, removing her coat. Lily groaned softly. "Mom, don't hover." "I won't," Margaret said, stepping back. Julian smiled. "Actually, she plays better when you're here." Lily rolled her eyes but resumed playing. Margaret moved to the corner chair. She watched her daughter's fingers glide over the keys, watched Julian lean in slightly, guiding but not touching. His voice was patient, gentle. "You're rushing the emotion," he murmured. "Let it ache a little." Margaret felt that sentence land somewhere too close. After the lesson ended and Lily hurried out to take a call from a friend, Julian gathered the scattered sheets into a neat pile. "She has real instinct," he said. "She gets that from her father," Margaret replied automatically. Julian looked at her. "I don't think so." The air shifted. "And what do you think she gets from me?" Margaret asked lightly. He hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he was choosing whether to give it. "Depth," he said finally, "and restraint. Sometimes too much of it." She laughed softly. "You've known us for 2 months. That's long enough to see who listens and who performs." The comment startled her. "Are you saying I perform?" "I'm saying," he said carefully, "you seem like someone who hasn't been heard in a while." Margaret should have deflected, changed the subject, mentioned traffic or scheduling. Instead, she asked, "And you think you can hear me?" Julian didn't smile. "I try to." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. Margaret stepped toward the piano, brushing her fingers lightly across the keys. "I used to play," she said. "Why did you stop?" She shrugged. "Life." "Or someone told you it wasn't practical?" That one stung. Richard had never forbidden her dreams. He simply reframed them. Practicality, stability, timing. She looked at Julian. "You're very observant." "It's my job," he said quietly. Lily re-entered the room, oblivious to the current she had interrupted. On the drive home, Margaret felt unsettled. Not because anything improper had happened, but because something had. That night she stood in the kitchen long after everyone went to bed. The house hummed with central heating and distant traffic. Her phone rested on the counter. She told herself she was checking Lily's rehearsal schedule. Instead, she opened Julian's contact. There was no reason to text him. She typed anyway. "Thank you for encouraging Lily. It means more than you know." The response came minutes later. "She deserves someone who believes in her." Margaret stared at the words. "And what about me?" she nearly typed. She erased it. Upstairs, Richard's office light was still on. A shadow moved behind the frosted glass door. She walked halfway up the stairs, then stopped. Instead of going to her husband, she returned to the kitchen. Another message arrived. "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but you look different today. Lighter." Her breath caught. "Different how?" she wrote. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, returned. Like someone who remembered something about herself. Margaret leaned back against the counter. She remembered being 22, ambitious, reckless, certain that love would be consuming, not negotiated between calendar invites. She typed slowly. Maybe I did. The days that followed slipped into a pattern. Rehearsals extended by 10 minutes. Conversations drifted from music to books to disappointments to the quiet sacrifices adulthood demands without applause. Julian never crossed a physical line. He didn't need to. One afternoon, as rain struck the studio windows in uneven rhythms, Lily left early for a study group. Margaret lingered, claiming she needed to confirm a recital date. The room felt smaller without Lily's presence. Julian sat on the piano bench, fingers resting lightly on the keys. "Play something," he said. "I'm rusty." "Then let it be imperfect." She sat beside him. Their shoulders nearly touched. Margaret began with hesitant chords, simple and fractured. Julian didn't interrupt. He listened. Halfway through, her fingers trembled. "I don't remember the rest," she whispered. "Yes, you do." His voice was closer now. She tried again. This time the melody returned. Not clean, not polished, but alive. When the final note faded, neither of them moved. "You see?" he said softly. She turned her head. They were closer than she'd intended. Close enough to see the faint scar near his eyebrow. Close enough to feel warmth radiating between them. "This is dangerous," she said. "Music?" he asked, though he knew. "No." He didn't pretend innocence. "You're lonely," he said quietly, "and I'm not blind." Margaret's pulse hammered. "I'm married." "I know." Silence. "Are you happy?" he asked. The question felt like a blade slipped gently between ribs. She thought of Richard's distant kisses, of dinners where they discussed strategy instead of dreams, of the way he touched her like habit, not hunger. "I don't know," she answered honestly. Julian's hand moved, not to grab her, not to claim, but to rest lightly over hers on the piano keys. The contact was barely there. It was everything. Margaret should have pulled away. Instead, she let herself feel it. Alive, desired, seen. For a fleeting, terrifying second, she imagined leaning forward, imagined crossing that invisible threshold. But footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the studio, someone locking up for the night. Reality snapped back into place. She stood abruptly. This can't happen. Julian nodded once, though his hand lingered a fraction too long before releasing hers. "Then don't let it," he said. But as Margaret walked out into the damp evening air, her heart racing like she'd committed a crime, she knew something irreversible had already begun. Not a kiss. Not yet. Something far more dangerous. Permission. By early October, the air in Westchester had sharpened. Leaves gathered along the Whitmore's driveway in curated shades of amber and rust, as if even decay had agreed to remain aesthetically pleasing. Inside the house, however, something less photogenic had begun to settle between the walls. Richard noticed it first in small ways. Margaret's phone, once abandoned casually on countertops, now rested face down. She smiled at messages she didn't explain. She volunteered to drive Lily to lessons even when the housekeeper was available. At first, he told himself it was nothing. Margaret had always been attentive, devoted, predictable. But predictability, Richard believed, was the foundation of loyalty. One evening, as they prepared for bed, he watched her from the doorway of their bathroom. She stood at the sink, removing her earrings, her expression distant, almost luminous in the mirror's soft light. "You seem busy lately," he said. She met his gaze in the reflection. "Busy how?" "Preoccupied. That's not a crime." "No," he agreed. "It's just new." Margaret turned off the faucet. "Maybe I'm allowed to be new." The sentence lingered in the air like perfume, subtle but unmistakable. Richard studied her. "Is there something I should know?" There it was, not accusation, not yet, just inquiry dressed in civility. Margaret's pulse quickened. She thought of Julian's hand brushing hers, of conversations that had grown too intimate to call accidental. "There's nothing," she said. It wasn't entirely a lie. Nothing physical had happened, but something emotional had ignited, and it pulsed beneath her skin like a hidden current. Richard nodded slowly. "All right." He kissed her temple before turning off the light. The kiss felt investigative. Downstairs, Caleb sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, headphones abandoned around his neck. His laptop screen reflected in the darkened window behind him. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Proof, maybe, or reassurance. He had grown up in a house that valued composure. Problems were solved with spreadsheets. Emotions were discussed at appropriate volume. Arguments, if they happened at all, were discreet and brief. But lately, the silence felt different. His mother laughed more at her phone. His father stayed later at the office, even on nights when no meetings were scheduled. And at dinner, something had shifted in the choreography. They no longer reached for each other's hands unconsciously. They performed it. 2 nights later, Caleb walked past his father's office and paused at the partially closed door. Richard was on the phone. "I can't keep doing this indefinitely," Richard said, voice low but firm. You knew that from the beginning. A woman's voice responded faintly through the speaker. Caleb couldn't make out the words. "I'll handle it," Richard continued. "Just give me time." Caleb stepped back before the floorboard could betray him. Handle what? He went upstairs with a heaviness he couldn't name. Margaret, meanwhile, was unraveling in quieter ways. She found herself anticipating Julian's messages with a hunger that embarrassed her. Their conversations had drifted beyond music, into childhood disappointments, into regrets, into the versions of themselves they had abandoned. One afternoon, Julian sent a simple text. "I dreamed about you playing again." She stared at the screen. "That's inappropriate," she typed. She deleted it. "What was I playing?" she sent instead. His reply came quickly. "Something you wrote yourself." Her breath caught. She hadn't written music in 20 years. "I don't write anymore. Maybe you stopped because no one was listening." She closed her eyes. Richard hadn't asked about her dreams in years. Not unkindly, just not at all. Julian did. That evening, guilt wrapped itself around her like a second skin. During dinner, Richard described the potential merger, his tone animated. "We're expanding aggressively," he said. "It's a risk, but calculated." Margaret studied him. Calculated. Was that what this was? A risk she was quietly evaluating? "You're not eating," Richard noted. "I'm not hungry." Caleb glanced between them. "You guys okay?" he asked suddenly. Both parents turned toward him. "Of course," Richard said smoothly. "Why wouldn't we be?" Margaret added too quickly. Caleb shrugged, but his eyes lingered on his mother's face. Later that night, Margaret stood alone in the dark living room. The only light came from her phone screen. Julian had sent a photo of the empty studio. The piano bathed in soft lamplight. "It's quiet tonight," he wrote. "Feels incomplete." Her heart pounded. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why?" "Because it makes me want to believe them. Because it makes me feel like I matter. Because it makes me forget I have a husband upstairs." Instead, she typed, "Because it complicates things." 3 dots appeared. Maybe things were already complicated. She didn't respond. Years ago, that secrets rarely stay hidden. Years ago, that secrets rarely stay hidden forever. The next morning, as Margaret showered, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Richard glanced at it instinctively. Julian Hayes. He didn't open the message. He didn't need to. The name was enough. When Margaret emerged, wrapped in a towel, she found Richard sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in his hand. "You forgot this," he said evenly. She walked toward him slowly. "Thank you." Their fingers brushed as she took it back. "Who's Julian?" he asked. The question was calm. Too calm. Margaret met his eyes. "Lily's music teacher." "And why is he texting you at 7 in the morning?" Her mind raced. She could lie. She could deflect. "He's confirming her rehearsal schedule," she said carefully. Richard held her gaze for a long moment. "Is that all?" She nodded. The silence stretched thin. Down the hallway, Caleb stood frozen outside his bedroom door. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but voices carried. He couldn't hear every word, only tone, tension, and something else. Fear. Inside the bedroom, Richard stood. "I trust you," he said finally. Margaret swallowed. "I know." But trust, she realized, was no longer the foundation of their marriage. It was a fragile agreement balanced over unspoken truths. As Richard left for work, he kissed her, this time fully on the lips. It felt less like affection, more like a claim. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching his car disappear down the driveway. Her phone vibrated again. "Julian, are you okay?" She stared at the message, heart pounding. Across the street, a neighbor waved cheerfully while walking her dog. The world looked normal, but inside the Whitmore house, something had begun to fracture. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a thin crack beneath polished marble, and everyone in the family could feel it. though none of them yet understood how deep it ran. Richard Whitmore did not believe in reckless decisions. He believed in timing, in leverage, in quiet containment, which was why, for nearly 7 years, no one had known about Vanessa Cole. Not the board, not the neighbors, and certainly not Margaret. Vanessa was not a lapse in judgment. She had been, at least in the beginning, an inevitability. They met during a late merger negotiation in Manhattan, two sharp minds circling risk and reward over scotch and spreadsheets. She was brilliant, composed, and unafraid to challenge him in rooms where most deferred. Desire had come later, or perhaps it had always been there, disguised as admiration. Richard never considered himself unfaithful in the emotional sense. What he and Vanessa shared was contained, compartmentalized. It did not threaten his home life. That was how he justified it. Until the night she told him she was pregnant. Margaret was at a charity retreat in Connecticut, where Richard received the call. Vanessa's voice had not trembled. "I'm keeping the baby," she said. He had closed his office door before responding. "Are you sure?" "I'm not asking for permission." He respected that about her. They had discussed options, discretion, logistics. Money was never the issue, visibility was. The solution had been arranged quietly. Vanessa relocated to a townhouse in Brooklyn under the guise of expanding a subsidiary branch. The child, a boy named Adrian, was born without announcement. Richard visited occasionally, always during business trips, always under plausible pretexts. He told himself he was managing complexity. He told himself he was protecting everyone. He told himself Margaret would never understand the nuance. Back in Westchester, suspicion had begun to ferment into something heavier. The morning after he confronted Margaret about Julian, Richard drove into Manhattan earlier than usual. But he did not go to the office. He went to Brooklyn. Vanessa opened the townhouse door wearing a soft gray sweater, her hair loosely pulled back. Adrian's laughter echoed faintly from another room. "You look tense," she observed. "I might be losing control at home," he replied. Vanessa studied him. "Margaret?" He nodded once. "Do you think she knows?" "No." "Then what's the problem?" Richard stepped inside, removing his coat carefully, as if order could still be imposed by precision. "There's someone," he said. "A music teacher." Vanessa's lips curved, not amused but unsurprised. "You didn't expect loneliness to remain one-sided forever, did you?" "That's not what this is, isn't it?" Adrian toddled into the hallway then, 2 years old, dark-haired, wide-eyed. Richard froze for half a second before bending down. "Hey there," he murmured. The child looked at him with mild curiosity. No recognition. Not yet. Vanessa watched the exchange quietly. "You can't control both worlds forever," she said softly. Richard stood, jaw tightening. "I'm not choosing between them." "You already did," she replied. Loosened his tie, studying her in a way that made her uneasy. "Do you ever think about what would happen," he asked casually, "if everything we built just collapsed?" Margaret's heart skipped. "Why would you ask that?" "Hypothetically." She looked at him carefully. "You don't ask hypotheticals." A flicker passed through his eyes. Admiration, perhaps. She knew him well. "Sometimes," he said, pouring himself a drink, "people destroy stability, chasing something temporary." Her breath caught. "Are you talking about me?" "Should I be?" Silence thickened. Caleb hovered at the kitchen entrance, unnoticed. Margaret stepped closer to Richard. "If you're accusing me of something, just say it." Richard set the glass down deliberately. "I'm saying marriages don't survive secrets." The irony hung between them like smoke. "Then maybe we shouldn't keep..." Later that night, while Richard showered, Margaret stood in their bedroom staring at his phone on the dresser. She had never checked it before. Trust had once been instinctive. Now it felt naive. The screen lit up again. Vanessa Cole. "Adrian has a fever. He keeps asking for you." Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her. Adrian. She didn't remember any client, colleague, or distant relative named Adrian. Her hands trembled as she opened the thread. Photos, dozens of them. A toddler with Richard's eyes. Richard holding him on a park bench in Brooklyn. Richard kneeling beside a birthday cake with a single candle. The timestamps went back years. Years. Margaret stepped backward as if physically struck. The bathroom water shut off. She locked the phone and placed it exactly where it had been. When Richard emerged, towel around his waist, she was sitting on the edge of the bed. "We need to talk," she said. His body stilled almost imperceptibly. About? She looked at him, not with suspicion now, but with something far more devastating. Recognition. How old is he? The silence that followed was absolute. Richard did not ask who she meant. He knew. Margaret's voice broke, but only slightly. How long have you been lying to me? For the first time in years, Richard Whitmore had no prepared answer. Not for investors, not for the board, not for this. 7 years, he said finally. The number hit like a detonated truth. And you call me reckless? She whispered. It wasn't like that. Then what was it? She demanded, rising to her feet. Strategic? Efficient? Manageable? His composure cracked. It didn't affect our family. Margaret let out a hollow laugh. You have another child. Richard's silence confirmed everything. Tears blurred her vision, but her voice remained steady. You destroyed us long before I ever considered stepping outside this marriage. His eyes sharpened. So you admit there is something? Margaret hesitated. For the first time, her guilt felt complicated. No longer pure betrayal, but reaction. I haven't slept with anyone, she said. Yet. The accusation lingered. Down the hallway, Caleb stood once again in the dark, hearing raised voices through the wall. He didn't understand the words, only the fracture. Inside the bedroom, two truths collided at once. Margaret's emotional affair, Richard's secret son. Neither innocent, neither honest. And suddenly, neither certain who had broken the family first. The house remained standing, but the foundation was no longer intact. Caleb Whitmore had always believed that truth, no matter how ugly, was better than pretending. He just hadn't expected to be the one who would have to uncover it. The night everything fractured began quietly. Rain tapped against his bedroom window, while muted voices drifted up from downstairs. His parents had stopped trying to argue softly. Their restraint had eroded in increments over the past week, tight smiles at breakfast, clipped responses at dinner, doors closing harder than necessary. Caleb lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, earbuds in but music paused. He heard his mother's voice first. How long were you going to keep him hidden? Then his father's, controlled but cracking at the edges. I was protecting this family. By building another one? Silence followed, heavy, suffocating. Caleb sat up slowly. Another family. His stomach twisted. He stepped into the hallway, careful with each footfall. The staircase curved down toward the foyer, giving him a partial view into the living room where his parents stood facing each other like opposing attorneys. Margaret's face was pale but steady. You don't get to judge me, she said quietly. Not after this. Richard's jaw tightened. At least mine wasn't emotional. Caleb frowned. Wasn't what? Margaret laughed bitterly. You think that makes it better? Did you sleep with him? Richard demanded. The word him sliced through the room. Caleb's pulse spiked. Him. Julian's name surfaced in his mind. The music teacher. The one who smiled too warmly at his mother during recitals. I asked you something, Richard pressed. No, Margaret shot back. But I thought about it. Is that what you want to hear? The admission hung in the air like a confession in court. Caleb's breath grew shallow. He pulled his phone from his pocket without fully deciding to. At first he told himself he needed proof, that maybe he had misunderstood. He opened the voice memo app. Downstairs the argument escalated. You humiliated me, Richard said. You humiliated yourself, Margaret replied. 7 years, Richard. A child. You think I wanted this? I think you wanted both. Caleb felt something hot and violent rise in his chest. His parents, the polished, admired, untouchable Whitmores, were frauds. Every family photo, every holiday card, every speech about integrity. A lie. Margaret's voice wavered for the first time. I was lonely. And that justifies... No, she cut in. It explains it. Caleb's hand trembled as he inched down 2 steps, phone angled toward the living room. Richard's next words came out sharp and cutting. You were lonely? Try managing 2 lives. Try knowing one mistake could destroy everything. Margaret stared at him. It already has. The rain intensified outside, pounding the windows as if demanding entry. Caleb's chest felt tight. 2 lives. Another child. His mother in love with someone else. The world tilted violently. He retreated upstairs before they could see him, heart hammering. Inside his room, he locked the door and pressed his back against it. His phone screen glowed in the dark. The recording had captured everything, every accusation, every confession. He replayed the fragment. A child. Did you sleep with him? 7 years. The words sounded uglier through speakers, less controlled, more human. Caleb's throat burned. He thought about school, the way classmates admired his father's success, the way teachers complimented his strong family values, the way social media painted their home as aspirational. He opened Instagram, scrolled. There it was, his mother's post from 2 weeks ago, a filtered sunset photo captioned, "Grateful for love that lasts." The hypocrisy made him dizzy. Without fully thinking, he switched apps, TikTok, then back. His hands moved faster than his judgment. He clipped the recording, just enough to capture the rawest lines. "You have another child. Did you sleep with him?" 7 years, Richard. He stared at the audio file. This would hurt them. This would hurt him. He knew that, but humiliation had already seeped into his bloodstream. It pulsed through him like something toxic. If their life was going to implode, he didn't want to be the only one drowning in it. He uploaded the audio with a black screen. No caption, just the sound. His finger hovered over post. For a second, one fragile, suspended second, he considered deleting it. Then he thought of Adrian, a brother he never knew existed. He pressed share. Downstairs, Margaret felt her phone vibrate on the coffee table. They're Richard's. Then both again. "What now?" Richard muttered, grabbing his device. His expression changed almost instantly. Confusion, recognition, horror. Margaret watched color drain from his face. "What is it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned the screen toward her. A black video. Thousands of views climbing rapidly. The audio of their fight echoed through the speaker. Margaret's own voice accusing, shaking. Richard's words defensive and exposed. She covered her mouth. "No," she whispered. Notifications flooded in. Texts from colleagues, from neighbors, from unknown numbers. Richard's phone rang. He ignored it. Margaret's hands trembled violently as she refreshed the page. The views doubled in seconds. Someone had already reposted it, with captions. "Westchester power couple exposed." She looked toward the staircase instinctively. Caleb stood at the top, face pale, eyes burning. "You did this?" Richard demanded. Caleb didn't deny it. "You lied to us," he said, voice breaking. "Both of you." Margaret stepped forward. "Caleb, sweetheart, don't," he snapped. "Don't call me that." The rawness in his tone sliced deeper than any public scandal. "You had another kid," Caleb said to his father. "And you," he turned to Margaret, "you were going to cheat." Margaret's voice cracked. "I didn't, but you wanted to." Silence. The truth didn't require action to wound. Richard ran a hand through his hair, a gesture uncharacteristically undone. "You have no idea what you've done," he said to his son. Caleb laughed bitterly. "I think I do." Outside, headlights slowed in front of the house. Phones were lighting up across Westchester. Inside the Whitmore home, the collapse was no longer theoretical. It was public. And for the first time, none of them could control the narrative. Upstairs, Lily's bedroom door opened slightly, her confused voice floating down the hall. "Mom?" Margaret closed her eyes. The darkness she had stepped into weeks ago had now swallowed the entire family, and there was no turning the lights back on. By morning, the Whitmores were trending. Not nationally, not yet, but in Westchester, Manhattan finance circles, and the tight ecosystem of private schools and country clubs, their names moved fast, whispered in group chats, dissected in comment threads, forwarded in clipped audio files that no longer even required context. The black screen recording had been reposted with subtitles. "You have another child? Did you sleep with him?" 7 years, Richard. The house phone began ringing at 6:12 a.m. Richard didn't answer. He sat at the kitchen table in yesterday's shirt, laptop open, watching his inbox flood. Subject lines stacked one over another. "Board emergency meeting, 9:30 a.m. We need clarification. Press inquiry." Margaret stood at the sink, unmoving, staring out at the frost gathering on the lawn. Her own phone buzzed relentlessly. Mother's from Lily's school. A senior partner's wife. An unknown number that texted simply, "Shame on you." Upstairs, Caleb had locked himself in his room. Lily hadn't come out at all. Richard finally closed his laptop. "You need to call the school," he said, voice tight. Margaret didn't turn around. "Which one?" "The music academy." Her stomach dropped. As if summoned by dread, her phone rang again. The caller ID read, "Hudson Valley Conservatory." She answered with trembling fingers. "Mrs. Whitmore," the director's voice was strained but formal. "We've reviewed the situation. Given the nature of the recording and the public reaction, we have no choice but to suspend Mr. Hayes pending investigation." Margaret's grip tightened around the phone. Suspend? For what? For inappropriate involvement with a parent. There was no... Perception matters, the director interrupted gently. Parents are already threatening to pull donations. The word donations felt like acid. This isn't fair, Margaret whispered. I'm sorry, the woman replied, but the board must protect the institution. The line went dead. Margaret stood frozen. Across the room, Richard watched her carefully. He lost his job, she said. Richard exhaled slowly. Not relief, not quite satisfaction. Something colder. That's unfortunate, he said evenly. She turned to him then, eyes blazing. Unfortunate, she repeated. You had a child with another woman, and you humiliated this family with a teacher, he shot back. I didn't. You wanted to, he cut in. The argument might have reignited fully if not for the sharp knock at the front door. Both of them stiffened. Another knock, firmer. Margaret moved toward the foyer slowly. Through the frosted glass panels she saw silhouettes, cameras. Richard swore under his breath. When she cracked the door open just slightly, a man's voice rushed forward. Mrs. Whitmore, is it true your husband fathered the secret child? Is the music teacher involved still employed? How long has the affair been happening? Margaret shut the door immediately, her pulse roaring in her ears. Reporters, she said. Richard's jaw tightened. Who contacted the press? They both looked instinctively toward the staircase. Caleb appeared halfway down, pale and hollow-eyed. I didn't, he said quietly. I swear. Margaret believed him. Social media had done the rest. Tasted fragile. Richard stood in his home. Tasted fragile. Richard stood in his home office, staring at the skyline beyond the window, though Manhattan lay miles away. His phone buzzed again. Vanessa. He answered this time. They know, she said immediately. How? The audio mentions a child. He closed his eyes. No names. Not yet, she replied, but people are connecting dots. In the background he heard Adrian coughing. You need to protect him, Vanessa said softly. He didn't choose this. Neither did Caleb, Richard thought. Neither did Lily. I'm handling it, he replied automatically. Vanessa's voice hardened slightly. You don't get to handle this anymore. The call ended. Richard felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Powerlessness. Julian nodded, though they both knew it was temporary. Julian nodded, though they both knew it wasn't. His phone had not stopped vibrating since dawn. Strangers calling him a predator, a homewrecker, a disgrace. He hadn't touched Margaret beyond the hand resting over hers, but perception had already rewritten the story. His gaze lingered on the piano. He thought of her playing again, hesitant but alive. He wondered if she regretted ever walking into the studio. He wondered if he did. Back at the Whitmore house, neighbors had stopped pretending not to stare. The car slowed at the curb, someone inside clearly filming through the windshield. Lily finally came downstairs, eyes red. Everyone heard it, she said quietly. They're sending it around school. Margaret's heart broke at the sound of her daughter's voice. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Lily looked at her father. Is it true? Richard didn't respond fast enough. That was answer enough. Lily turned and walked back upstairs without another word. The house felt cavernous, exposed. Margaret sank into a chair, her body suddenly heavy. This is my fault, she murmured. Richard let out a hollow laugh. You think this started with you? She looked up sharply. For a moment, something almost honest passed between them. Not blame, recognition. They had both been living in separate shadows long before Caleb hit post. By late afternoon, the views had cost $1 million. Memes circulated. Think pieces about suburban hypocrisy. Threads analyzing vocal tones like amateur detectives. The Whitmores were no longer a family. They were content. That evening, as dusk fell and camera crews remained parked discreetly down the street, Caleb emerged from his room. His bravado had evaporated. I didn't think it would go this far, he said quietly. Richard looked at him for a long moment. That's the problem with the internet, he replied. You don't control what happens after. Margaret reached for her son's hand. He let her hold it. For the first time since the recording surfaced, silence filled the house without shouting. But it wasn't peace. It was aftermath. Outside, flashes of cameras sparked briefly in the dark like distant lightning. Inside, the Whitmore family sat in the dim kitchen light, no longer polished, no longer untouchable. Just human, and painfully visible. The scandal did not fade after 48 hours the way Richard had hoped. It evolved. Speculation hardened into investigation. Anonymous accounts began posting timelines. A finance blog published photos of Richard entering a brownstone in Brooklyn over the past several years. Grainy, but damning. The headline was precise. Executives' business trips raise questions after viral audio leak. Margaret saw it at 2:17 a.m., unable to sleep. She read the article twice before clicking the embedded image. Richard, unmistakable. Coat collar turned up. Entering the same townhouse again and again across different dates. Her breath slowed into something dangerously calm. She rose from bed and walked down the hallway toward his office. He was awake. Of course he was. The door stood slightly ajar. "We need to stop pretending this is manageable," she said. Richard didn't look surprised to see her. "It was never meant to be public," he replied. "That's not what I'm talking about." She placed her phone on his desk, the article open. "How many times?" she asked. His jaw flexed. "Margaret, how many birthdays did you attend?" Silence. She stepped closer. "Does he know you're his father?" The pronoun landed heavily between them. Richard leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, he looked tired, not irritated, not defensive, just exposed. "He's 3, he said quietly. "His name is Adrian." The room seemed to contract. "You said it didn't affect our family," Margaret whispered. "I made sure it didn't." "You made sure we didn't know," she corrected. He didn't argue. She let out a brittle laugh. 7 years of deception, and you had the audacity to interrogate me about text messages. It wasn't the same. No, she agreed. It was worse. By morning, the children had seen the article. Caleb stood in the kitchen holding his phone like evidence. "So it's true," he said flatly. "There's a kid." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Richard spoke carefully. "Yes." Livy's voice trembled. "Is he our brother?" The word brother broke something open in the room. "Yes," Richard answered. Lily sank into a chair. Caleb's anger returned instantly, sharp and unfiltered. "You lied to us our entire lives." "I didn't lie about you," Richard said. "That's not how lying works," Caleb shot back. Margaret watched her children fracture in real time. She turned to Richard. "Tell them everything." His gaze flickered to her. A warning. "Now," she insisted. Richard inhaled slowly. "It started during a merger," he began. "Vanessa and I—" "Don't say her name," Lily whispered. He faltered but continued. "We didn't plan for a child." "But you kept him," Caleb said. "Yes." "And you visited him," Caleb pressed, "while telling us you were working late." Richard didn't deny it. Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Did you ever think about what would happen if we found out?" "I thought I could protect you from it," he said. Margaret laughed softly, without humor. "You mean control it?" The truth settled like ash. Later that afternoon, Margaret drove alone to Brooklyn. She didn't tell Richard where she was going. The townhouse was smaller than she expected. Modest, tastefully renovated. When Vanessa opened the door, she recognized Margaret immediately. They stood facing each other in silence. Two women bound by the same man, the same deception, but not the same story. "I wondered when you'd come," Vanessa said calmly. Margaret's voice was steady. "I needed to see what 7 years looks like." Vanessa stepped aside. Inside, toys were scattered across a woven rug. A small pair of sneakers near the staircase. Then she saw him. Adrian. Dark hair. Richard's eyes. He looked up from a stack of wooden blocks and blinked curiously at the stranger in the doorway. Margaret's breath caught. Not with jealousy, not with rage, with grief. This child was innocent, entirely. "He doesn't understand any of this," Vanessa said quietly. "He just knows his father visits." Margaret's throat tightened. "Does he visit often?" "Often enough," Margaret nodded slowly. "I never wanted to destroy your family," Vanessa added. "It was already fractured," Margaret replied softly. They stood in silence as Adrian toddled toward them, offering a wooden block in small, trusting fingers. Margaret crouched instinctively. "Hi," she whispered. The boy smiled. Something inside her collapsed completely. Not from betrayal, but from the realization that her marriage had not been wounded recently. It had been hollowed out for years. That evening, back in Westchester, the confrontation resumed. "I met him," Margaret said as soon as she entered the house. Richard froze. "You what?" "I met your son. "Ah, son," Lily corrected from the hallway. The correction stunned them all. Margaret looked at her daughter with aching tenderness. "Yes," she said softly, "your brother." Richard ran a hand over his face. "You had no right." "No right?" she repeated. "You forfeited that argument when you built a second life." Caleb stepped forward, eyes burning. "Is she staying?" The question stunned them. "No," Richard said immediately. Margaret looked at him sharply. "You don't get to decide that anymore," she said. "What does that mean?" he demanded. "It means," she replied calmly, "this marriage is over." The words did not come with hysteria, they came with clarity. Lily began to cry quietly. Caleb stared at the floor. Richard's voice dropped. "You think divorce fixes this?" "No," Margaret said, "but staying in a lie destroys us further." He stepped closer. "And what about Julian?" Margaret held his gaze. That ended the moment this went public. It was true. Julian had sent one final message that morning. "I'm sorry for what this became. I never meant to hurt your children." She hadn't responded. Some connections, she understood now, were born in darkness and could not survive exposure. Richard's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. "For years," Margaret continued, "I thought I was the one drifting, the one who had failed to keep us close. But you were gone long before I ever looked elsewhere." He didn't argue, because he knew. Caleb's voice broke through the silence. "So what happens now?" Margaret looked at her children, Shuli looked at them. "Now," she said gently, "we stop pretending." Outside, reporters still waited. Online, strangers still debated blame. But inside the Whitmore house, something irreversible had finally been spoken aloud. The foundation was not cracked anymore. It was gone. And there was no rebuilding on ground that had never been solid. Winter arrived early that year. By December, the Whitmore house no longer felt like a curated showroom. Boxes lined the hallway. Artwork had been removed from walls, leaving faint rectangular shadows where framed memories once hung. Divorce papers sat on the kitchen counter beside unopened holiday cards. Margaret signed her name slowly, not because she doubted the decision, but because she understood its weight. Richard stood across from her, pen in hand. He looked thinner, the sharp edges of his confidence worn down by weeks of public scrutiny and private reckoning. His leave of absence from the firm had quietly become permanent. A strategic transition, the official statement had called it. In truth, the board had needed distance. So had she. When he finished signing, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to negotiate. Caleb had stopped reading comment sections. The internet had moved on to a new scandal, as it always did. But the consequences remained offline. Friends who no longer visited, teachers who watched him too closely, whispers that didn't quite fade when he entered the room. Lily began therapy. She asked careful questions about half-siblings and loyalty, and whether loving her father meant betraying her mother. Margaret answered honestly when she could. "I don't hate him," she told her daughter one night. Lily looked confused. "How?" "Because hate keeps you attached to the wound," Margaret said softly. "And I'm trying to heal." Richard moved into a modern townhouse closer to Manhattan. Smaller, efficient. He saw Adrian openly now. No more aliases on calendars, no more fabricated conferences. The first time Caleb agreed to meet his half-brother, it was awkward and quiet. The second time, slightly less so. Children, Margaret realized, adapted faster than pride. One evening, after dropping Lily at a friend's house, Margaret found herself parked outside the now dark music conservatory. The sign still bore its polished lettering. Julian's name had been quietly removed from the website weeks ago. She hadn't spoken to him since the message he sent after the scandal broke. Not because she blamed him, but because she needed to understand something first. She needed to understand herself. Back at her half-empty house, Margaret stood in the living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes and winter light. For weeks, she had replayed everything in her mind. Julian's hand over hers, the way he had said her name like it meant something new. The thrill, the awakening. Was it love? Or was it oxygen in a suffocating room? She walked to the piano Lily rarely touched anymore and lifted the lid. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She began to play, not Chopin, not something remembered, something tentative, unfinished. The melody wavered at first, uncertain of its direction. Then it steadied. Margaret closed her eyes. The affair had not destroyed her marriage, it had exposed it. Her loneliness had not begun with Julian. It had begun years earlier, in quiet dinners, in strategic partnerships disguised as intimacy, in compromises that accumulated like dust. Julian had been a mirror. Richard had been a structure she outgrew, and she, perhaps, had been complicit in her own silence. When the final note faded, she did not feel shame. She felt clarity. Her phone buzzed softly on the bench beside her. A message from Richard. Caleb asked if we can all have dinner next week. Together. No press. Just us. Margaret stared at the words. Family no longer meant what it used to. But maybe it meant something truer now. She typed back. Yes, we owe them that. After a moment, another message appeared. I'm sorry, Richard wrote. She believed he meant it, but apology and reconciliation were not the same. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, deliberate, covering the lawn in white. Margaret stepped onto the porch, letting the cold air fill her lungs. The house behind her was no longer a monument to perfection. It was a place where illusions had died, and strangely, that felt cleaner. Her marriage had ended. Her reputation had cracked. Her children had been forced to grow up too quickly. But truth, she realized, had not destroyed them. It had stripped away performance. What remained was painful, but real. Across town, Richard sat in his new townhouse, watching Adrian sleep in a small bedroom painted pale blue. His phone rested on the table beside him, Margaret's reply still glowing on the screen. For the first time in years, there were no compartments left. No second lives. Only consequences and the possibility of doing better. In Westchester, snow continued to fall over manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs. The Whitmore house stood unchanged from the outside. White, elegant, composed. But inside, it no longer held darkness disguised as perfection. It held something far less glamorous. Honesty. And though honesty had brought the whole family down, it had also done something unexpected. It had given them the chance to rebuild, not as an image, not as a performance, but as flawed, fractured, and finally visible human beings.